Hello everyone and welcome to week one of our class, Critical Reasoning. Week one, there's really no graded assignments. I am asking you to do a number of very brief and ungraded quizzes, and you do need to do those. They do count, at least you have to take them to show that you're thinking through these things. Week one especially, and week two to a certain extent, are really just a kind of a review of basic concepts in reasoning, basic logical concepts, basic concepts having to do with argumentation. I think we're all more or less familiar with these, and if I didn't think that, or if I thought that this material in some way was difficult or involved some sort of complex study of some sort, I wouldn't have made the things as brief as I did. Really what I'm trying to do is reinforce a kind of vocabulary of reasoning that may, hopefully, come in handy later in the course when I ask you to do things in terms of forming your own arguments and assessing the arguments of others, which is really what most of the course is about. In any field of study, it's always good to have a vocabulary, a sort of a technical or semi-technical vocabulary at your command. There's, of course, many more concepts and terms, words that are helpful when we're engaging in reasoning, and especially when we are critiquing the reasoning of others. Now, these are just really, I would say, what I have here in week one, basic elements of argumentation, pretty much the most basic and vital concepts in logic. And logic is reasoning. Logic is the sort of rules of reasoning and inference. Well, that's one of our words, inference. Premises and conclusion. Really, the premises and conclusions, inferences, validity, truth, and soundness. They're all very. Once you go through this material, I think one of the most obvious things about it, perhaps except for its obviousness, is the interrelatedness of all of these concepts. Premises and conclusions, there are the basic elements of an argument. An argument, as we will think of it and treat it, is any set of statements which are related to each other in such a way as at least one of the statements is meant to support at least one other of the statements. And that could be put any number of different ways, but that's one way of putting it. If I offer you a premise, then certainly I have a conclusion in mind. If I've made a conclusion, that means I've offered premises of different sorts in support of that conclusion. An argument is composed necessarily of at least two statements. Any argument of any complexity will be composed of many more statements than that, but at least two statements, one of which serves as a premise and another of which serves as a conclusion. And the idea is that the premise in some way or another is offering evidence or a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. It may not do that. There are bad arguments that are still arguments. That's one of the things that interesting conceptual things once you think about arguments and think about premises and conclusions and think about reasoning. Is if something is offered as a reason to believe something else and provides really almost practically no real evidence in support of the conclusion that it supposedly does support, then is it still an argument? I would say yes. That's because there are bad arguments. There are arguments where arguers think, or at least try to make other people think, that they are offering good reasons in support of a conclusion when they really are not. But those are still arguments. They're just bad arguments. Moving on to the second sort of folder here, inferences and validity. Inference is making a judgment that one thing follows from another. Making an inference is making a judgment that on the basis of one statement, or one proposition, that another one must be true as well, or perhaps it could be true or is more likely to be true as well. So an inference is something that we do. We infer. The sort of flip side of inference is implication. I mean, the proper way I think of speaking about it is that human beings make inferences when they reason. they make an inference from one statement, one proposition to another. Those statements or propositions themselves imply other statements. So, from the fact that Barack Obama is president of the United States right now, I can infer that he won the Electoral College. He got the most votes in the Electoral College during the last presidential election. That is an inference that I have made, a judgment. If we just take the proposition itself, Barack Obama is currently president of the United States, we would say that that statement implies that Barack Obama won the majority of votes in the Electoral College during the last presidential election. That is, conscious beings who can think, they make inferences. The statements themselves have implications or imply other statements. So when I make an inference, again, that inference is just the claim that on the basis of one thing, as if we presume one thing being true, then another thing is true as well. That's, I think, what an inference is. Those inferences may be mistaken inferences, or they may be justified inferences. If they are good inferences, that is, if I have inferred what is actually implied by a statement, then it's a valid inference. If I infer something which is not actually implied by a statement, then we would call my inference invalid. So validity is really is a term that applies to reasoning. Good reasoning, generally speaking, is valid reasoning. Bad reasoning is invalid reasoning. And the test of validity is, that is, whether it's good or bad reasoning, whether the inferences that somebody has made are valid or not, is a question about whether the things that they say follow from other statements actually do follow. Those would be valid inferences. So arguments themselves are valid because their reasoning is valid. That is, the reasoning is good. That is, what is claimed to follow actually does follow. Now, of course, this gets all very complicated once we recognize, as I hope I have noted in this folder on inferences and validity, that there's a huge difference between deductive arguments and inductive arguments. And I'd like you to read through that material. Most of the arguments that we'll be dealing with, I would say, I would characterize them, that most of the arguments that we're dealing with in this course are inductive. But we'll talk more about the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. In many ways, it's simply a matter of form. But deductive validity is a very strict thing, whereas if there is such a thing as inductive validity, that is validity in inductive argument, whether that term applies, it's a much looser thing. A good deductive argument is entirely valid, and what that means is that its conclusion follows necessarily from its premises. We don't hold inductive arguments to the same sort of standard. We say that in inductive arguments that at best the premises of an inductive argument make the conclusion very likely. But the whole point of it being an inductive rather than a deductive argument is that even in the best inductive argument, there's still the possibility that the conclusion is false, even if we're sure that all of the premises are true, whereas that is not true of a deductive argument. If an argument is deductively valid, that means that if the premises are all true, it's not even possible for the conclusion to be false. And one can imagine that in the real world, very few arguments of any interest really hold up under that kind of scrutiny outside of mathematics, logic, and some other very specialized and highly abstract areas. Finally, we have the notions, the concepts of truth and soundness. Despite the fact that reasoning in a certain way is independent of truth, right? That is, we go upon premises which may or may not be true, and we can sort of follow out the implications of those premises without really being sure or having any idea whether our premises are true. That's actually very, very true, but the whole point of argumentation is truth in one way or another. That is, and this will be followed up upon in detail in the second week of the course, aspects of critical reasoning. That is, the purpose of reasoning is always truth. Either we're trying to establish that something is true through argument, that is, we're making an argument, we're trying to establish the truth of our conclusion, or we're assessing whether someone else's argument has established its conclusion is true. That is, we're assessing someone else's argument, we're critiquing somebody else's argument, and what that really means is ultimately, have they established that their conclusion is true? Or we're trying to find truth through our own reasoning, which is really dialectics, and we'll see that as being a very important part of philosophy, for instance. So we use argument to either establish truth, because we want to argue something as being true, we want to prove something true. We use reason to critique and assess other people's arguments, which is basically, have they established as true their conclusion. And we use reason to find truth. Truth is at the very center of things. But the thing about truth, there's no method. You know, logic cannot give you a method for finding out whether something is true. That is an art. That is, how do we actually determine whether statements or propositions are true? That being said, there are different sorts of truth, and one of the things that I just have you sort of, in a very glancing way, look at is the difference between empirical truths, which are truths because they're true in the sense that they correspond to the states of affairs in the world, as opposed to logical truths, which are true just by their very form. That is, there are different sorts of truths because there are different ways in which things are made true, you might say. In any case, we won't get too far into that because that would be a metaphysics class or a general philosophy class and not a class in reasoning, but I thought it was worth looking into. Finally, the notion of soundness. Soundness is a good term to have when you're dealing with arguments. A sound argument is not only a good argument, it has a more specific meaning. A sound argument is one that fulfills two criteria. Number one, all of its premises are true, which is problematic to ever actually determine in the first place, but that's the criterion. So first of all, a sound argument is one where all the premises are true, and secondly, where the reasoning is entirely valid. If we have a sound argument, and we have true premises and valid reasoning, we have a good argument. We have an argument, if it's deductive argument, it establishes beyond doubt the truth of the conclusion. If it's an inductive argument, it gives us good reason to believe, absent total certainty, that the claim is true. So soundness is a very good word to keep in mind when you are making your own arguments, when you are assessing the arguments of others. Is an argument sound? Because it makes you focus on the crucial thing. Are the premises that I start with true? Are they reliable? And secondly, is the reasoning that I build upon those premises, is it good reasoning? Is it valid reasoning? So those are just, this is just a review to get started, and just making sure that we have a sort of basic idea of argumentation, what it is, what its very basic elements are, and just sort of reinforcing it. We're going to be talking about arguments, we're going to be assessing arguments, making arguments of our own. So it's good to build up a very familiar vocabulary with which to talk about arguments.